Hi, this is PHQ, questions from the community here at Personality Hacker. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And today we've got a question that was emailed into us by Steven. Just to kind of summarize Steven's email, he says that he's recently, and by very recently he means the last 3 days, shown an interest in personality types. So he's been doing a lot of internet tests, spent an incredible amount of time trying to figure out which type he is, and he has narrowed it down to one of the NT or intuitive thinker types in the Myers-Briggs system. So he said that the results come back as INTP, ENTJ, and ENTP, although he has himself narrowed it down to INTP or ENTJ. He really resonates with the concepts of the commander or field marshal, which is generally ascribed to ENTJs, and also the analyst or the architect, which are INTPs in the Myers-Briggs system. He said, ENTJs feels correct. Upon reading it, I genuinely felt like that's me and was relieved to know that it was a normality in the world. INTP resonates, though, for the simple case of them being mistaken for autistic, ADD, ADHD, etc. He said he's been called it all. So he says, so to summarize and bring an end to this email, I have 2 questions. 1, what is the most effective way of accurately finding out which personality type I am? And 2, is there any reason that I cannot aspire to be both without going against the nature of my personality traits?
Wow. So the first thing that comes to mind, a lot of times we look for language in what somebody asks, and he actually used 2 words in the question. What's the most effective way, which would be an ENTJ is using a process called effectiveness to accurately determine my personality type, which is what an INTP would use, and accuracy would be their function to make decisions. So sometimes we look for clues in how people ask questions into their personality type, and that can often be there. Obviously, we haven't talked to you, and we don't know you personally to be able to really give you a sense of what we think your personality type might be. However, there are some principles we can talk about in understanding this.
Right. So I'm without doing a live profiling session, an active profiling session, I don't think that I could, in good conscience, say, yeah, you're definitively this type based on a couple of emails back and forth. I would say, though, that the most telling piece of this entire email is ENTJ feels correct. Upon reading it, I genuinely felt like that's me and was relieved to know that it was a normality in the world. That's, as far as I'm concerned, what we're really looking for in the Myers-Briggs system is a person's best fit type. That means that they read a description of that type, and that is the reaction they have. They have a feeling of that's me, and a feeling of relief, actually. When you find your best fit type and you read a description, like a solid description of that type, there should be a sense of understanding, relief, like, wow, I didn't know that people out there were like me other than just me. And it should feel like it fits like a glove. So based on this very cursory back and forth, I would say I'd go with ENTJ. But what's really interesting about this is the idea of resonating with INTPs because of a lot of descriptions talking about how they could be mistaken for having autism or ADD or ADHD. This is something I think that happens for people a lot when they're trying to figure out their type and they read descriptions of other types where portions of it resonate with them. That is where the confusion gets created, because they'll go, wow, I really resonate with this type, but I totally resonate with this piece of this type over here. So which one am I? And the rule of thumb is the one that makes you feel relief. That is your best fit type. There are going to be components of other personality types that resonate with us, especially if they are similar in how they show up. So take, for example, INTPs and ENTJs. You would think that, well, they're both NTs, but they have completely different, sandwich letters. I call them sandwich letters because they're the ones on the outside. So they have totally different letters. One's an E and one's an I and one's a J and one's a P. So how could they be similar? Well, when you look at the cognitive functions or the mental processes, which is what we always encourage people to do when they're exploring the Myers-Briggs system, when you look at the cognitive functions, both ENTJs and INTPs lead with what's called a thinking process. ENTJs lead with extroverted thinking, or what we call effectiveness, like you mentioned earlier, Joel. And INTPs lead with introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy. So even though they're a thinking process that is exploring a different world or is turned toward a different world, ENTJs have a thinking process that is focused outwardly. So it's about understanding metrics and analytics and data in the outside world, which is why we call it effectiveness. It's about getting things done. It's about trying to figure out the best, most streamlined, most effective way to accomplish a project. And then INTPs go inward when they're using their thinking process. And that's why we call it accuracy, because it's more about data management within the person themselves. So even though it's a completely different expression, they're both leading with a thinking process. And that means a couple things are going to be specific to ENTJs and INTPs or shared by them that won't be shared by other types. One thing being that the converse of having or leading with a thinking process means your inferior process, or what we call your blind spot or your 3-year-old in the car model, is going to be a feeling process. So that means that you're going to be more distanced from a feeling component within you than most other types, and definitely more than all the other intuitive types.
And also, both of these thinking processes that you mentioned are decision-making processes. So you're showing up to the world, the driver in your car, in that car diagram, is showing up to the world looking to make, like, you come to the world making decisions first and foremost. Like, you're looking to be decisive about things. You have different criteria, but that decision-making process is driving you forward. And then you supplement that with a learning process. So that's something else that you share in common as an ENTJ and INTP, is you're both coming with what's technically called judging processes in the Myers-Briggs system, but they're basically how you make decisions, the criteria you're using to make decisions, and you lead with that in both of these types as well.
And then you supplement, like you just said, you supplement with a learning process. They're both going to supplement with an intuitive learning process. Now, again, they're different styles of intuition. One is extroverted intuition. That's what an INTP is going to use, or what we call exploration. And the other one is introverted intuition, which is what an ENTJ is going to use, and that's what we call perspective. So they're very different styles of thinking and intuition, and yet they're in the same positions in the car model. So sometimes these, weirdly enough, even though you'd think that they'd be very different types, and they are very different types, sometimes they can get confused for each other because of these these similarities. Now, why would I specifically mention those when it comes to an ENTJ and an INTP? Well, being called autistic or ADD or ADHD, I think specifically the autistic piece, it feels to me like we throw around this term a little too cavalierly these days. There are, of course, absolutely people who legitimately, truly have autism, and they do what they can to navigate through the world despite having something that, is actually a rather challenging, it's a rather challenging situation for them to be autistic. However, I have noticed that people will call somebody autistic because they're leading with a thinking process, and that makes them less socially adept. And we get this concept in our head that you have to be very socially adept or you're autistic, right? Like just because you are not socially adept, or maybe you might not be super charismatic, or maybe you are not super tactful, or whatever that is, then you must be autistic. You must have an issue there. And the types that lead with thinking and have more of a detachment or more distance between their conscious functions to their feeling processes, like they're not as consciously aware of their feeling processes, that's something that's more of a blind spot for them, they are going to show up in the world being potentially a lot less tactful. And so they might get mislabeled, possibly labeled accurately if they also have autism. However, if that's the only component that a person, like a parent or a teacher, is going by, then they could get mislabeled as autistic simply by leading with a thinking process, which both ENTJs and INTPs lead with.
And the other thing I want to mention specifically about ENTJs in this scenario, oftentimes the confusion around type can be because the ENTJ leads the process that's technically called extroverted thinking, and it's about effectiveness. It's about getting the effective thing done. They are an extrovert, but the way they extrovert may not be a very people-centric way of extroverting. They're not necessarily going to parties and being the socialite extrovert. They might be extroverting in a functional sense, like about structure and processes in the outside world, how things are built and constructed and architected. And so oftentimes when they're in social situations, they can appear like they're an introvert, which can also cause some of this type confusion because they're not showing what we see, what we in pop culture think of in terms of extroverted behavior, because we think of extroverted behavior as always being really social and friendly and outgoing and bubbly. So this is something else that can cause some of those confusions.
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of ENTJs are not, some of them are pretty social. A lot of them were more about project management, though, and getting things done. I know quite a few ENTJs who have mistyped themselves as INTJs because they don't think of themselves as, like you said, the pop culture version of extroverted. So yeah, there can be some type confusion between these two types. But I would say if in any of these, between two types scenarios, really, if you can, go look at the cognitive functions that each type utilizes and ask yourself if those are really resonating with you. And then look at some really solid descriptions. And if you need to, go to multiple sites, go to multiple descriptions of these types, and the one that fits like a glove, the one that makes you feel relief, right? That's an important piece, is probably the one that you are. Now, the second question that Stephen asked, I thought was really intriguing. This is, I think, something that has, that people have confusion around. And that is there any reason that I cannot aspire to be both without going against the nature of my personality traits? So I'll just say this. There are multiple different ways to utilize this system. And there are a lot of different philosophies on how it works, lots of different philosophies on how to make it work for you. And so I'm not going to full sail say, even though, I do basically say, yeah, you're not two types. You're one type. I say that because that's the most helpful way for me to see the system. When I'm using it for personal development and when I'm coaching clients and other people through using Myers-Briggs for specifically personal development, seeing it as, you're two different types, so just manifest those two types as, as healthily as you can, is not as nearly as effective or, I believe, as helpful as understanding that your mind is wired in a very specific way. And I think what really sort of convinced me to see it as like you're one type, you have a best fit type, and your mind is wired in very specific ways based on that type is Dario Nardi's work. Now, we've referenced Nardi before in the past, and Nardi wrote a book about the neuroscience of personality types. And he connected people to, mind mapping, basically EEG machines, and mapped their minds. And It wasn't, it was not the most complex, comprehensive setup because it's still embryonic. And yet the data that they called from that indicated that when you are using the primary cognitive function, or what we call the driver process in the CAR model, when you're using the driver process for your personality type, your brain goes into flow. Like, as in, your entire brain lights up like a Christmas tree. And it doesn't do it for any of the other cognitive functions. There's 8 cognitive functions. Each type is going to lead with one of those cognitive functions. And when you are using the dominant cognitive function for your type, your brain lights up like a Christmas tree. It goes into the definition of flow that we use all the time, which is what we stole from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book, Flow. And that is, you gain energy by using this mental process, or activities that call on this mental process. You gain energy by doing these activities as opposed to expend it. So when you figure out your Myers-Briggs type and you find out what the dominant mental process or the driver mental process in your CAR model is, and you do activities that engage that mental process, then you are giving yourself the gift of flow. You're giving yourself the gift of being able to regenerate your batteries. And if you're not in that process often enough, that is usually when people get low energy, they get dysthymic, they get depressed, they're not really sure why they don't feel like themselves. And it's because they've not created a circumstance that allows them to be in flow often enough, or call on that dominant mental process. So for us at Personality Hacker, we feel like there's a lot of benefit into finding your single best fit type. So you can find that dominant mental process and do activities that are fuel for you, that are nourishing for you and your personality type. And then once you find that, then you can look at the co-pilot process, or what's called the auxiliary cognitive function, and figure out what is your highest leverage for growth. And then you can figure out what your 10-year-old is, or what's technically called your tertiary, and figure out how, that part of your mind impacts your personality, and the same thing with a 3-year-old or the inferior process. All of these show up in very unique, specific ways for you and your type. And so knowing that information is extremely high leverage. And it doesn't really work if you add yet another layer on top of it. Basically what happens is, if you think you're an ENTJ and an INTP at the same time, you basically are now engaging all 8 mental processes. And that is not a bad thing if you're looking at it through another lens of use, right? Like, you could maybe even call that, an an ENTJ and an INTP together would probably fall in line with like John Beeb's concept of the 8-function model. So you'd be ENTJ first, INTP second, potentially. So that would be a very interesting way of seeing John Beeb's model. And at the same time, it's interesting and intriguing, and I haven't yet run into a space in which a person has so massively mastered that co-pilot 10-year-old and 3-year-old position in their car to a point where now they're ready to graduate to really developing those last 4 functions. So if you're a rock star personal development person and you have just done absolutely everything you can to grow yourself as like the absolute best version of yourself and you're just completely rocking it, yeah, go ahead and see yourself as also an INTP and add those last 4 functions. But if you are at this point in this stream of personal development, like most of us are, then, it's the power of full engagement, is the power of focus. Focus on those 4 functions and really master them within your best fit type. And I think that you'll have the highest return.
Yeah, and this is kind of just think about this for a moment. This is a backlash against thinking like any one person can be distilled down into one of 16 types. That's the world we live in, and that's the business we have of talking about these types. And yet, there's 7 billion people on the planet. And are we really saying that all 7 billion people are so specifically just these types? Obviously, we have so many parts of us that are so nuanced and different. These are just tool sets we're using to apply to our personalities for what you said, which is usefulness. How can we use this for personal growth? This isn't define everything about a person. This isn't their entire experience. This isn't every part of them. There's all sorts of other factors and other maps and models that come into this. It's just a framework. It's just a tool set. It's one of the best ones that we've found for launching you on that successful personal growth journey, because then you custom tailor your personal growth to your personality, which makes sense in my mind. Like, why not do that? And that's why it's so useful to pick one type that really feels like it fits best, because that's going to inform how you go about your personal growth journey. And if you think you're two kind of not conflicting types, but 2 very different ways of approaching the world, well, what's the path of growth for you then? How would someone recommend what books and resources and courses and growth things to do based on all this extra data coming in? It makes it much more simple to have one type that you're focused on moving forward in that realm. Yeah,
because if you're an ENTJ and an INTP at the same time, then my recommendation is to develop both introverted intuition and extroverted intuition at the same time. And those are very different processes. And so you're basically sort of toggling between 2 worlds. And not that developing both of those styles of intuition there wouldn't be any harm in it. And at the same time, I don't think it would have the real return on investment that somebody's looking for when they're on a serious personal development path. So again, your litmus test is that feeling of relief. I read this description and I rested into it. Like, I felt understood. I felt relief that this was normal. I feel really good about this.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to deep dive into this, episode number 44 on the main podcast, we talk about the question, does the ambivert personality type exist? In other words, can you be multiple personality types? Can you have multiple dichotomies represented? Can you also be an introvert and an extrovert? Can you be a thinker and a feeler? And we really unpack this in that podcast. We spend like 45 minutes talking about this. And when you listen to that, you're going to understand why we feel that it's a yes and a no, basically. Go listen to number 44, because we think that will really clarify some things if this is something you're still working through.
Yeah, so that was a really great question. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you've got more questions, come over to personalityhacker.com and feel free to ask them. We can answer them here on PHQ, which is the Questions from the Community podcast.
One of the easiest ways to ask us a question is to shoot us an email at info@personalityhacker.com. And in the subject line, please put the letters PHQ. That makes it a lot easier for us to get through questions and figure them out. And we'll probably set up a system pretty soon where we'll have a place to direct people specifically to put in some questions. But right now, shoot us an email at info@personalityhacker.com and put in the subject line PHQ.
And actually, we're going to have a system where people can call in and leave a voice question is how I'd want to move this forward, because then we can hear your voice and it feels like almost like we're talking, have a conversation. So that's something we're going to be setting up soon as well. But we'll talk to you on the next PHQ question and answer from the community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Talk to you next time.